So welcome everybody to the first seminar of our series promoted by the Center for Gender Studies and the Bloomsbury Network. It is my great pleasure to have Professor Nadje Al-Ali today for opening this new series. Nadje is very well known to most of you. She's been the chair of the Center for Gender Studies for many years, and she's very prolific writer, academic, and also an activist. Nadje is writing on subjects in relation to gender theory, feminist theory, diaspora, women, gender, and conflict in the Middle East and in the diaspora. She's also very eclectic. She's interested in food as well as in aesthetics. So her last publication, actually, which is, I think, about to come out, it's a co-edited volume with colleague, and the title is We Are Iraqis, Aesthetics and Politics in a Time of War by Syracuse University Press. But of course, before that, she's published extensively in the field of women and gender relations in the Middle East. One of the most recent publications, co-edited, co-authored volume entitled What Kind of Liberation? Women and the Occupation of Iraq in 2009, a co-edited volume with the title of Women and War in the Middle East, and her monograph Secularism, Gender and the State in the Middle East, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2000. The list can go on, so I will just stop here and thank Nadje for being here with us today. And the title of the presentation is Gender in Counter-Revolutions in the Middle East. Oops.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Great to see so many of you, and I'm really pleased that Ruba, Gina, and Judith have given me the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And I'd like to mention Judith particularly because she has worked so hard to put this series together, and also she's become our AV expert, as you see. So I would like in this talk, which is called Gender in Counter-Revolutions in the Middle East, and I'm going to say something about the title in a second, I would like to mainly address two questions. Can you hear me, by the way? Okay, great. Okay, so the first question is, does gender matter in revolutionary times? Now, this is clearly a rhetorical question given the context of the seminar series, but I would like to address in greater detail why I think that it matters greatly. Now, the second question is even more polemic and provocative, I think, which is democracy bad for women? Now, and I would like to address this particular question through several angles. The first angle is the historical vexed relationship of feminists to authoritarian modernizing states. And second, the question of what do we mean by democracy and what does and doesn't it do for women? As you notice, I've very much tried to avoid the term Arab Spring. And I just wanted to say a little bit why I'm doing this. I know that the Middle East is also a problematic term. It's a sort of externally assigned label. But from my vantage point, from the position of my research and my political engagements, I find it currently less problematic than the Arab Spring, because working with Iraq, I'm actually working with lots of non-Arab ethnic groups who are very much involved in protest movements and who feel marginalized by the terminology. Also because I personally think that the Arab Spring, the term, leaves out the, to my mind, very strong relationship to Iran and the protest movement in Iran, and particularly the gender dimension of protest movements. So that's why I use Middle East, but I know that this is a problematic term. And also I would say that when I was asked to provide a working title, which was quite a while ago, I didn't know exactly what I was going to talk about. And I'm actually not going to talk so much about the Middle East, because I think by now it is very difficult to make huge sweeping generalizing statements about the very different developments happening in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria, and so on, Jordan. And so I'm going to focus on Egypt, the sort of empirical context, Egypt. However, having said that, everything that I do is very much shaped by the work I've done for over 10 years on Iraq. And although Iraq and the invasion and occupation of Iraq is a very specific context as well, and you can't generalize, but I can't help but drawing comparisons and learning and the sort of some of the analytical and political lessons I've learned in the Iraqi context. I'm also trying to see in how far they apply to the wider region. And while I actually think that it's important to be, I'm an anthropologist like Ruba, I think it's very important to pay attention to historical, empirical context. I do think that, of course, the broad questions that I'm addressing are questions that are more widely relevant, and I will come back to that in the conclusion. Now, what I'm going to do is really share with you a number of related observations linked to the two set of questions I mentioned in the beginning. I want to start out by addressing the issue of external perception. Initially, many people were asking me, where are the women? Now, I feel that this question had more to do with people's stereotypes. And when I say people's stereotypes, I mean people in the UK, in Europe, in the States. So that this question had more to do with people's stereotypes than empirical realities on the ground. So what I'm referring here, of course, are sort of the stereotype of the invisible, oppressed women without agency. Now, later on, in many media accounts, and this is now moving more specifically to the Egyptian context, Asma Mahfouz became known as the leader of the revolution after posting an online video calling young people to demonstrate en masse, helping to spark the revolution that forced President Hosni Mubarak's resignation. Yet, and I'm sure many of you are aware of that, Asma Mahfouz was not alone, nor was it a Facebook revolution. Women participated side by side with men in the protests across Egypt and Tunisia, as well as in Yemen and Bahrain. They were involved as trade union activists, as members of political parties, professional organizations, women's rights groups, informal networks, and dissident youth and individual initiatives. No doubt, women have been very much involved in the virtual communities of bloggers and Facebook users. Virtual activism has been big in Egypt since the 1990s. But it would be misleading to be technologically deterministic and speak about a Facebook revolution. The lines between online and offline activism tends to be very blurry. And as many Egyptians will tell you, I mean, at some point, actually, there was no internet and there was no mobile phone network. Now, during the height of the actual protests to oust Mubarak, and subsequently at all following protests, women of all generations and social classes were on the streets in large numbers. Notably in places like Tahrir Square in Cairo, where men and women mingled for weeks in extremely crowded and volatile situations. Many Egyptian women reported that they had never felt as safe and had been treated as respectfully as during the times, these 18 days. Now, one of our former MA students, Dina Wahba, in her MA dissertation, which Ruba and I just recently read, but also during the year, she was speaking about what she called a suspension of gender norms and relations during the 18 days. But that was last year during the so-called 18 years of the revolution, and actually other people have challenged that and said that might have been the case just on Tahrir Square, but when you went outside, it was a very different situation. Now, today, clearly, it's a very different situation as harassment and violence are rampant. Now, the other point to stress in terms of women's involvement is that women did not just start to be involved in 2011. The history of political involvement of women, both in terms of more specific women's rights activism, but also other political struggles. And here I would say that unfortunately in Egypt, and as in other countries in the region, there's often this perception that women's rights activism is not political. So if you are involved in, let's say, anti-imperialist struggle or in class struggle or independence struggle, that is political, but women's rights activism is not political. And even some women's rights activists themselves conceptualize politics in terms of the wider political struggles, which I think is very problematic. But in any case, in Egypt and also in the region more widely, we find that women have a long history of being involved specifically in women's rights activism, but also in wider political movements. And there is no doubt that there exists a long history of large-scale women's political participation also in, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia. It was, of course, more limited in Bahrain, Libya, Yemen, and Syria. And just very briefly, obviously I don't have time to go into the history of the Egyptian women's movement, but actually in Egypt specifically, we go back all the way to anti-colonial independence struggle at the turn of the 20th century, where women were very much involved as part of this wider movement, but then also specifically asking for women's rights. And actually my own work, which was my PhD on the Egyptian women's movement in the mid-90s, revealed that women's rights activists were engaged in contestations about the state in terms of the shaping of gender policies, but also in terms of wider issues related to citizenship rights, social justice, and so on. And despite the fact that, of course, not of course, but as is often the case, not only in Egypt, but in many countries, most of Egyptian women's rights activists are urban-based, actually most of them Cairo-based, many of them are middle class, upper middle class. But many of them have also in the past been involved in what one calls sort of grassroots activism, and have also been involved in trying to find non-hierarchical ways of organizing. And in the 90s, when I did my PhD, I found that there were some Egyptian women's rights organizations that were very much reproducing the prevailing political authoritarianism, very sort of hierarchical organizations that were just reproducing basically the state. And then I found that there were other organizations that were much more consciously trying to come up, not only sort of challenging the state in terms of its gender policies, but actually also trying to come up with a new political culture that was more democratic and less authoritarian. Now, much has been made initially about the peaceful nature of protests in Egypt and also in Tunisia. Now, without doubt, it has been much easier for women to participate in the protest movement and wider opposition politics in Egypt and Tunisia, where the protests had initially taken a more or less non-violent character, silmiya. But as I found when I went to Egypt a few months ago and I spoke to people, that actually many people said that there was an overstating of silmiya, this overstating of peacefulness, that even during the 18 days there was violence. And there was one anecdote I just quickly want to share. One professor at the American University of Cairo, who is also quite well-known activist, told me that one day as there was tear gas and it was really quite violent, and there was some guy coming with plastic bags, and they thought that he was bringing them some onions or masks to help them deal with the tear gas. And he was actually carrying candles. And he was telling them, this looks really bad. We have to sort of put some candles to show that, we are peaceful. So, I think, to my mind, she was maybe sort of overstating the other side. But certainly, there was also sort of an aspect of how does it look? And I have to say that Dina, who is our MA student, actually also confirmed that view. Now, without doubt, over the last year, there has been regular violence and an increased militarization of conflict. Feminist scholars have pointed to the links between militarization the militarization of societies and increased gender-based violence, which has happened actually cross-culturally in different historical contexts. Now, the feminist theorist and activist Bell Hooks stated several decades ago, and I quote, "I think we do not win peace through violence, and what we have seen historically is that when progressive regimes come into power through violence, they often do not last. They often end up corrupted by the same forces that they initially were protesting against. So in order for these revolutions to have long-standing meaning, there has to be something other than the initial moment of violent resistance." Of course, I think there is a kind of fetishization of nonviolence going on as well, and I myself have sort of shifted actually from a kind of, I guess, sort of pacifist, no violence at all in any context to a more nuanced view, but it's still something that I'm kind of working on and working out, and I'm happy to discuss later on. But certainly it's clear that in the Egyptian context, as violence and militarization have increased, political spaces started to shrink for women. And the first indication was actually on the 8th of March in 2011, the 8th of March being International Women's Day, when around 200 women gathered in Cairo's Tahrir Square to mark International Women's Day, and they were basically denied the right to freedom of expression. They were surrounded by a rival protest of men and attacked with insults, including "this is against Islam," "go home," "go wash clothes," "you're not married," "go and find husbands." The situation then turned violent. The women were outnumbered and set upon by some men who pushed them to the ground and in some cases subjected them to sexual harassment. Now, men who were sympathetic and were protesting with the women received similarly violent treatment. The military personnel stood by and failed to act. Now, I would say that this incident was indicative for the shift in mood where women and gender justice was concerned, but also the systematic marginalization of women in the various political processes we have seen unfolding since last year. In the elections of November 2011, women in Egypt voted more than men. In some constituencies, up to 70% of eligible female voters turned up compared to below 50% of men. In one voting station in Cairo, women formed the longest queue in our recorded history. However, only 8 of the 480 plus seats in parliament went to women. Now, the parliamentary elections gave the Freedom and Justice Party of the Muslim Brotherhood an overwhelming majority, approximately 40%. The runners-up were the Salafis, who gained 20% seats. Other MPs belonged to the liberal parties, revolutionaries, and a number of highly respected secular individuals, and some not so respected. Almost all of these newly elected representatives of the people were men. Unlike the quotas for workers and peasants, where the candidates were given slots on the list that gave them a fair chance of success, women candidates' placement suggested their inclusion was merely a gesture and their chances of success minimal. Dr. Manal Abul Hasan, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party and spokesperson for women's affairs, saw no problem in the low number of successful female candidates from her own party. She indicated that the new parliament, even if made up only of men, will do the right thing and deliver social justice in line with the party's programs, so that there was no need to be concerned by the absence of women. She even went as far as to say that women should not march in the streets to protest and protect their honor, since, and I quote, "it is incumbent on their fathers, brothers, and husbands to march and protest on their behalf." In her view, and one wonders whether it holds true for other members of her party, the concept of wilaya, or guardianship, overrides women's right to self-representation. I'm pointing here because we have a PhD student who is actually doing amazing work on this concept of guardianship, which is very important in the context of gender relations in the region. Her statement also confirms the view that it is not sufficient to have female representation and quotas, as token women tend to be women's worst enemies. Now, it might not be surprising that the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood are not too concerned with women's political participation, gender justice, and equality. But to me personally, more disconcerting is the fact that initially many secular political parties and leftist activists were not keen on gender as a political category or as a tool of analysis and struggle for justice. Even many female activists initially distanced themselves from feminist claims and demands and stressed their involvement as Egyptians, as citizens, and as revolutionaries, regardless of their gender. As I was hearing statements such as, "I'm here as a citizen, not as a woman," women's issues are not relevant to the revolution. During the early phase of the protests, I myself got quite frustrated and angry. Everything in me was screaming out, "Haven't you learned anything from history? What about Algeria? What about Palestine? What about Egypt's own revolution in the 50s and its aftermath? We know that revolutions, independence and national struggles, as well as wider social movements, what they do to women if they don't make claims related to their gender forcefully and systematically and from the very beginning. And we know if the wider goals and aims of political struggles are not linked to social justice and equality for all elements of society, including women, ethnic minorities, and other marginalized groups. We know this makes marginalized people in society, including women, very vulnerable. However, while the first phase of the toppling of Mubarak was characterized by the glossing over of gender, over the last year there has been a noticeable shift amongst many Egyptian women and men. This is largely due to the recognition that, and here I come to my next observation, if we look at the various ways old authoritarian regimes try to hold on to power, and Egypt is the case in point, women and gender relations have been very much at the core of counter-revolutionary processes. A day after International Women's Day, and I don't think it is a coincidence, the military violently cleared Tahrir Square of protesters and took at least 18 women into military detention. 17 of them were detained for 4 days. Some of them told Amnesty International that they were beaten, that they were subjected to electric shocks and subjected to strip searches. They were then forced to undergo Virginity Test and threatened with prostitution charges. One army official justified the actions on the grounds that these women were not like your daughter or mine. These were girls who had camped out in tents with male protesters. The implication is that women must know their place, and that place is not to take part in political struggle. Ironically, but again not surprisingly, we can see that gender norms, sexuality, and women's bodies are being instrumentalized in the old regime's attempt to hold on to power and privilege, and in the violent backlash and counter-revolutionary processes we have been witnessing over the past year. The treatment of female protesters took very different forms to that of their male counterparts. Women's bodies have emerged as a nexus for many of the principles and objectives of the revolutionary processes and also the counter-revolutionary processes. And here I'd like to actually share with you an observation by the historian and activist Khalid Fahmy, who put it the following way. The pivotal role of women and the female body in this revolution has manifested itself under many guises. First came the photographs in the nude that Alaa Matias posted of herself on her blog in a bold gesture to challenge existing taboos about the body and raise fundamental questions about who owns and controls it. I'll come back to that in a second. Then came the horrific video footage of a young woman whose body was stripped of veil and clothing. She was dragged and stomped in her naked defenselessness by army boots, and this at the doorstep of parliament and cabinet buildings. Then we watched the equally horrifying footage of Azahilal, who rushed to the defense of the woman in blue bra, as the victim mentioned above came to be famously known in the English language press, only to find her own body subjected to brutal beating, again by army soldiers. And finally, we saw tens of thousands of women taking to the streets in a mass rally of protest against the army's brutality and its systematic violation of the sanctity of women's bodies. These events show that the female body is at the heart of this great revolution in which women have emerged as a driving and galvanizing force. I'm going to now show a picture of a nude woman, so if you can't take it, look away, okay? Just to warn you, sorry if I offend anyone. Now is the time to look.
Nude women are everywhere.
Okay, right. Now, much can and has been said about Alaa Matias' posting of a nude photograph. But what I'd like to do is actually refer you to Maya Mekdashi's excellent article, Waiting for Alaa, published on Jadaliyya on the 20th of November 2011. I will just share the concluding paragraph. Alia's picture does not play by the rules, and this is why both liberals and Islamists have condemned her. She is not waiting for the right moment to bring up bodily rights and sexual rights in post-Mubarak Egypt. She is not playing nice with the patriarchal power structures in Egypt. She is not waiting her turn. Her mouth is not open and pouting. Her breasts are not large. Her eyes are not hungry or afraid. She is not wearing high heels. Her vagina is uncovered. She is not selling anything, and she is not trying to turn us on. Her use of fishnet stockings appears to be a commentary on the cliché of commodified seduction. Her nudity is not about sex, but it aims to reinvigorate a conversation about the politics of sex and the uneven ways it is articulated across the fields of gender, capital, and control. She is staring back at us, daring us to look at her and to not turn away, daring us to have this debate. Yet I would argue that one of the most significant developments concerning the right of women to their bodies and one of the most important acts of rebellion of 2011 was Samira Ibrahim's lawsuit against the army for subjecting her and 6 other women in March 2011 to the Virginity Test. Her lawsuit represented courage and perseverance, as well as her conviction that the army should be held accountable for violating the sanctity of her person. She was striving to achieve one significant aim of the revolution, namely the right of Egyptian men and women to bodily integrity and their entitlement to live in their country with dignity and freedom. Sadly, on March 11 this year, the doctor who carried out the so-called virginity test was acquitted in military court. Samira Ibrahim had earlier won a court case that ruled that virginity tests on female protesters was illegal and issued a ban. Yet the more recent trial of the military doctor who carried out the tests announced that he was innocent of charges of indecent behavior and disobedience of military orders. Now, both Islamists and the military have been using the trope of women's honor to drive back women protesters from the street. I was extremely moved by the December 20th, 2011 Women's March last year. It was amazing to see so many women of clearly different social classes, different political persuasions, and religious backgrounds to come to the street to protest the brutalization and humiliation of women by the military, sparked by the incident of the so-called woman with the blue bra. A much repeated slogan during the Women's March was, "Egypt's women are a red line." This slogan evoked mixed feelings in me. On one level, it was clearly a powerful tool to mobilize not only tens of thousands of women to join the march, but it also enabled solidarity by many Egyptian men, and it's sort of playing on the other slogan, "The military is the red line. We can't go there. We can't, challenge the military." Now, the army's use of sexual assault and humiliation had taken place with their full knowledge of the severe social stigma associated with these kinds of acts. Honorable women do not go out and protest. But women did anyway, and in great numbers, thereby subverting the army's attempt to deter female protesters. But what, to my mind, is slightly disconcerting is that the slogan, "Women are the red line," does play on traditional gender norms in terms of both ideal womanhood and ideal manhood, as well as the relation between the two. Now, over the past month, there has actually been a wave of protests in Egypt against various forms of harassment, sexual harassment. And harassment has emerged as a dominant theme amongst women's rights activists, as well as actually male activists, and that is definitely new. It was, very few individual activists and groups tried to make an issue out of it, and some did in the past, but now it's actually become big concern. And I should say that President Morsi has also taken this up. This is the new president. But many Egyptian feminists do feel quite uncomfortable with the way he is looking at it, because his discourse is mainly in terms of protection discourse. We have to protect our women, which then, when translated into laws and actually sort of gender norms, could be quite tricky. So despite these various forms of backlash, it's very important to stress that there has been a strong mobilization of women's rights, as well as women more broadly. Many previously apolitical Egyptians reacted to the various assaults on female protesters and women more generally. Egyptian women's rights activists actually have continued to work and influence male politicians and political parties. And for some reason, many of the women that I know seem to be involved in the Women's Committee of the Social Democratic Party. It's a whole sort of contingency, but there are sort of several other parties. Others don't want to work through political parties, they work through NGOs. And in addition to sort of long-established NGOs, there are now many, many new initiatives and networks. Now, I would argue that their work over the past year, paradoxically, has been helped by the brutal atrocities of the military and some of the rhetoric by the Salafis and Brotherhood more increasingly as well. So when we look at International Women's Day this year, it was very different. Thousands, very different to the previous year. Remember the image I showed you in 2011. This is just, very shortly after the toppling of Mubarak, and it was just a few hundred women, and they were basically attacked. But this year, International Women's Day, thousands of women joined, supported by many men, and there was a real mix of feminist, human rights activists, political parties ranging from socialists to social democrats, pioneers from the 9th of March movement for academic freedom, and also members of the old Kefaya movement. Thousands showed up and marched from the Egyptian Journalist Syndicate to Parliament, winding their way down the heart of Cairo and through Tahrir Square, holding up banners demanding the equal representation for women in the yet-to-be-selected Constitutional Committee, and registering their anger at proposed changes to personal status laws, which could mean that Egyptian women would lose some of their rights. Now, the Egyptian anthropologist and women's rights activist Hani Shukami commented at the time, and I quote, "What a difference a year can make. Women's human rights have, over the past year, gone from oblivion to becoming a cause célèbre of the people. This past week, there were daily chat shows on television celebrating women, inviting labor activists, socialists, feminists, and scholars of Islam to discuss gender-based rights and women's representation. There were celebrations to honor veterans from the field of women's activism, and Angam, one of Egypt's leading divas, sang a specially composed song that praised women as half of the world. Missing from these celebrations and demonstrations was the strongest and largest political party in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood and their Freedom and Justice Party. So another, aside from the military, another major cause of concern for women's rights activists are Islamist constituencies whose gender politics are viewed with great anxiety by many more secular-oriented women and men in Egypt, in Tunisia, and across the region. At the height of the euphoria in the early phase of revolutionary developments in the region, I often argued with Iranian friends and colleagues, whose own revolutionary experiences made them rather skeptical and worried about recent developments in the region. There is no doubt that Islamist groups are not only the best organized in terms of political parties, but they also appear to be well placed to convince many people that they would provide a viable alternative to the previous secular authoritarian regimes. However, I think it is crucial to recognize the variations and range of Islamist groups and their differing gender ideologies and visions. Analytically, it's important to consider the specific historical and current context of specific Islamist parties and groups. Egypt is not the Iran in 1979, neither is Tunisia. And while the Ennahda government in Tunisia has tried to be forthcoming in certain areas where women's rights is concerned, the internal fragmentation within the party has meant a wobbly, more than stable approach towards women. But I would say that I don't know that much about Tunisia, but from what I can see from afar, at least the leadership has sort of gone out of its way to try to at least assure women's rights activists that they're committed to some basic principles of equality and justice. I would say that in the Egyptian context, yes, I mean, people are worried about the Salafis. I think that extremists are still a minority, but they might not be the only or even the worst enemies of women. Maybe more disconcerting is the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party is busy constructing a gender narrative that is very much revolving around women's reproductive roles, the authentic family, and gendered responsibilities that seem to be quite far removed from the way many Egyptian women actually live and see themselves. On the other hand, it also reflects the way many Egyptian women see themselves. Yet the Brotherhood's demand to return to a more conservative personal status law, which they refer to as Suzan laws, and I'm going to say something about that in a moment, does have large-scale support amongst many sectors of the Egyptian population, including many women. Now, currently, one major rallying point amongst Egyptian women's rights activists is Article 36 of the Constitution. Article 36 states that women and men are equal as long as it does not contradict the rules of Islamic jurisprudence. Now, every aspect of the draft constitution is constrained merely by the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, which is problematic, but is actually a less demanding formulation. Now, the previous constitution, ratified in 1971, contained a clause that also constrained women's rights according to the rule of Islamic jurisprudence. But activists and lawyers fear that in the context of the growing political influence of conservative elements within the Islamist movements, the wording paves the way for fresh attacks on women's rights. Only last week, Tuesday, there was a demonstration. It was a coalition, I think, of 33 women's organizations in which protesters voiced concerns over Article 36 in the draft charter. The slogans raised included calls for the removal of Article 36 and demands for women's rights to be included in the new constitution. They also asked for disbanding of the existing assembly, which is drafting the constitution. Out of the 100 members of this assembly, only 7 are women. There have also been, no, not yet. There have also been several calls for secular political forces to boycott the Constituent Assembly because of the dominance of Islamists within that body. Most notoriously, the Assembly cancelled an article that had set a minimum age for women to get married and criminalized the trafficking for female minors. Now, the backlash against women in Egypt, but also the region more broadly, reminds us that women's reliance on the state to champion and support gender equality and social justice is problematic. It has already become obvious, and I have to say I saw it very clearly in the Iraqi context, in which politicians were very prone to compromise women's rights. Kind of the first thing that falls off an agenda is actually women's rights. And historically, Egyptian, Tunisian, and other regional women's rights activists have been challenged to not be co-opted by the largely secular authoritarian states modernizing gender policies and forms of state feminism. The state co-option has probably been most obvious in the Tunisian context, where the government continued with some form of state feminism throughout both Bourguiba's and Ben Ali's regimes. Now, when dealing with the dictatorship and the one-party system, it is very difficult for women's rights activists to operate independently outside given state structures. Yet in the past, authoritarian regimes have implemented measures to increase gender equality and social justice as long as these were perceived to be harmless to the regime and the status quo. This was conspicuous in Tunisia and also Iraq, and to also some extent in Egypt, where some women's rights activists collaborated with Suzanne Mubarak's National Union for Women. So that's Suzanne Mubarak, if you are in doubt. Now, I would argue that an exaggerated belief in the ability of the state and the main political party to promote women's rights does actually seriously diminish women activists' credibility and might limit their strategies and possible achievements in the long run. However, I also think that we have to be careful in terms of, I mean, it's easy for us to sit here and sort of point the finger and say, well, you know, you shouldn't have worked with the regime. I think it's a tricky situation. If a government does actually offer greater access to education, greater right in terms of labor force participation, what do you do? I think it's easy for us to judge, but I think it's quite complex. I'm running out of time. No, how much time do I have left?
Well, we want to have at least half an hour for discussion.
Okay, so I have 10 more minutes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, but I think what also needs to be stressed is that many women's rights activists in Egypt and elsewhere in the region have been, and this is bringing in gender theory now, have actually been intersectional in their approach. So, for instance, in Egypt, many of the Egyptian women's rights activists who were sort of their main concern, yes, was their activism around legal, socio-economic rights, political rights of women. They were also involved in the Kefaya movement, trying to topple the regime. They were also involved in anti-occupation policies, protests with relation to Palestine, with relation to Iraq. So many Egyptian women's rights activists were intersectional in that they interpreted their struggle for social justice with respect to gender as part of a broader broader struggle for social justice. However, now in the sort of post-Mubarak era, what you find is that the accusation of having been co-opted by the state is a very easy way to discredit women's rights activists. And I think that is not unique to Egypt. We also find it in the Iraqi context. We find it in the Tunisian context. And of course, it is true that some women's rights activists were co-opted, but many were not. And now things like the personal status code, which was it refers to a set of laws that was changed during the Mubarak regime, a set of laws that governs marriage, divorce, child custody, and inheritance. Now there is an argument to replace it with a much more conservative interpretation because it was Suzanne's law, totally obliterating, forgetting the fact that there was a long, long struggle by Egyptian women's rights activists who also tried to change the laws at the time. Okay, let me now sort of move on. And yes, I want to actually say something about democracy. Okay. Now, actually, it was at a workshop I attended about 6 months ago, and there were lots of activists from the region, and some of them from the region, from the Middle East, and some of them sort of posed this question, is democracy bad for women? Now, I think that from my perspective, having closely watched political developments unfold in Iraq, I have learned that just because elections are held, it doesn't mean democracy is being implemented. Worse, in the absence of viable democratic foundations, elections could become a dangerous exercise and fuel political violence. In such a case, winning elections is regarded as a matter of death and life, since the winner takes it all, and his and her power is unrestrained. Moreover, I learned from Iraq that a commitment to basic principles of freedom and equality is a prerequisite for elections to generate anything remotely democratic. I've learned that democracy is not merely about representing the majority, but it is about assuring the rights, freedom, and safety of those parties and followers who lost or are in the minority. Democracy is about assuring that those who have different views from those who have gained political control can still be expressed without sanctions or negative consequences, except if they are inciting to hatred and violence, of course. There's a very thin line between populism and democracy that is difficult to balance. Similar to what I had to watch closely unfold in the Iraqi context, I see in Egypt that when democracy is simply equated with elections, it does not deliver social justice and equal rights, certainly not for women, quite the opposite. And let me just sort of quickly, to conclude, go through a list of reasons. And the reasons are long. I'm just going to sort of zoom into some. I think there's a very toxic mix of international and national, historical, current, economic, and social factors. First of all, I would have to really sort of address global politics here. Global politics, more specifically, I would say US global politics, that has very much instrumentalized women and gender. I'm thinking about Afghanistan and Iraq in the sort of so-called war on terror scenario, so that resistance to Western imperialism nowadays is, even more so than before, very much expressed in terms of cultural authenticity, embodied in the pure, well-covered, and virginally or motherly local women. Secondly, a reaction to various forms of modernizing state policies targeting women by invariably corrupt, authoritarian, and patriarchal dictatorships, and the co-option of some women's rights activists and organizations now provide easy ammunition to discredit them, to discredit all women's rights activists. Here, I personally think it might have been wiser for Egyptian women's rights activists to demand a disbanding of the National Council for Women rather than to populate it with a different set of women. Thirdly, the divisions and tensions amongst secular constituencies, particularly amongst women's rights activists, who are competing over what issues to give priority to and who is the main champion of this, is seriously weakening its effectiveness and its opposition to both Islamist political forces but also conservative secular forces in terms of broader conservative patriarchal trends, discourses, practices, and policies. And now I'm saying something that probably is quite controversial. I'm saying it anyway. The currency of populist slogans, conspiracy theories, and twisted mindsets across the board of secular and Islamist constituencies and actors forces us to face a politically incorrect and uncomfortable truth. Populism and electoral democracy are close relatives. It is not this or that political strand, or even a dichotomy between secular and Islamist, that we need to worry about most. It is incompetence, lack of proper education, and what I mean here, not sort of memorizing information and getting degrees, but a sort of, thinking through critically, and an almost absurd postmodern free-for-all that's our biggest problem. And I don't think it's just in the Middle East, I think everywhere in the world. Fifthly, neoliberal economic policies and the global economic crises have worsened the Egyptian economic situation. Large-scale unemployment, lack of facilities and infrastructure have not only seriously eroded social and cultural rights and deteriorated living conditions, but have also led to a heightened crisis of masculinity. A return to traditional gender norms and relations where men can be real men and women can be real women is linked to a glorified past in which economic resources were more equally distributed and employment more easily available. So in my view, what we're witnessing in Egypt, as well as elsewhere in the region, is actually not so much about women. It is mainly about men. It is about a crisis of masculinity and men trying to fill a vacuum left by the toppling of authoritarian leaders who were promoting, maintaining, and reproducing specific gender regimes. Gender regimes that were certainly fiercely contested from within, but nevertheless delineated acceptable and hegemonic continuums of what a man should be like and what a woman should be like. Clearly, economic, social, and political anxieties about manhood and masculinities are articulated mainly in relation to women's bodies, sexuality, morality, as well as their position and roles within the newly emerging polities. Now, the list of reasons is long and complex, and I don't have either the time or the expertise to list them all. But I agree with Hania Shorkami, who forcefully argues that whatever the politics of Egypt's future governments and legislatures may be, some basic principles of rights and freedoms must be clearly stated and not left to the vagaries of elections. I would also like to stress that I'm not suggesting that the alternative is the status quo, or that I don't share the courage, determination, creativity, and energy of my friends and colleagues in Egypt and across the region. Quite the opposite. But what I'm suggesting is not only do we need to seriously rethink democracy, but we also need to recognize that revolutionary processes constitute high risk for the more vulnerable and marginalized within a society, whether it is based on gender, religion, ethnicity, or other markers of difference and social hierarchies. I'm also suggesting that political transitions, as we have seen unfolding in Egypt and elsewhere in the region, do simultaneously open up discursive, social, and political spaces to rethink not only the previous political order, but also gender regimes. And here we should not be divisive and righteous in terms of what works and what does not work. In my mind, we do need proper quotas to assure women's presence in the official state structures, but that alone is not going to do the trick. We need consistent, creative, collective action inside and outside the existing structures. We need alliances without compromising our principles, and we need transnational solidarity without imposing outside agendas. None of my friends and colleagues I'm in contact with would like to turn the clock back. They are frustrated, angry, exhausted, stressed, but they're also embracing change and the possibility of a revolution. Thank you.